Asking for water, a call to the Secret Service? From simple requests to more profound statements, here's what these U.S. presidents said in their last moments. After the Revolution, George Washington repeatedly expressed his wish to retire from public life, even as he oversaw the Constitutional Convention and was elected president twice. He was reluctant to accept either responsibility, and the farewell address he presented the nation with when he refused a third term has become one of the most famous pieces of his legacy. But Washington did not have a particularly restful time in private life, being deluged by visitors and driven by his own interest in the country's welfare to stay involved. Nor did he have very long to enjoy his retirement. 3 years after the end of his second term, Washington fell ill after being caught out on horseback in the rain and snow. His condition, initially a sore throat, worsened over the next 2 days.
His throat was so inflamed he couldn't get air through it.
Washington had a sense that whatever was wrong with him was fatal, and by the time a doctor arrived, he was fading fast. By December 14, 1799, he was dying. Washington's final hours were well recorded by his secretary, Tobias Lear, whose diary entry for that day are preserved at the National Archives. According to Lear, Washington was assuring his doctor by 5 p.m. that he was unafraid of death and that it was best to let it happen quickly. By 10, he asked that he wouldn't be buried until at least 3 days had passed. He asked Tobias if he understood, and when Tobias affirmed that he did, Washington said his last words, "'Tis well." By 1848, John Quincy Adams was one of America's most accomplished statesmen. In his long career, he had served as ambassador, senator, secretary of state, president, and finally, congressman for Massachusetts in the House of Representatives. That last role kept him busy from 1831 to 1848. Though often in the minority and an adversary of the Jacksonian Democrats who held the White House, Adams was deeply revered by his colleagues. He was known as Old Man Eloquent, and his oratories on everything from abolition to House floor rules were well regarded. It was during one such speech on February 21, 1848, that Adams's long career began its end. According to PBS, he began the day in good health. He was one of the few opposed to a resolution honoring officers of the Mexican-American War, a conflict Adams had been against. But when he stood to take questions, Adams suffered a massive stroke. His fellow congressmen tried to revive him, and when that failed, they carried him into the Speaker's office. He remained there for the next 2 days, never truly rallying from the stroke. Members of Congress and the press, who had at their disposal a newly installed telegraph in the Capitol, eagerly awaited news on Adams' condition. Doctors' attempted treatments were quickly disseminated to the public, and so were Adams' final words before his death on February 23rd. "This is the last of Earth, but I am composed." There were several witnesses to Andrew Jackson's death, and they all broadly agree on his last words, a variation of this line: "I hope to meet each of you in heaven. Be good, children, all of you, and strive to be ready when the change comes." According to writer Mark R. Cheatham via the National Endowment for the Humanities, the variation reported by Jackson's slave Hannah was, "I hope to meet you all in heaven, both black and white." That Jackson would have expressed such a sentiment and that a slave should have shared it as a tribute to a slaveholder's goodness strains credulity with us in the 21st century. But Hannah was a force in shaping Jackson's image for generations of Americans.
Jackson transformed the way we envision the president and his authority.
It's been said that Ulysses S. Grant's last word was water, but the same book that reports him saying so, The American Nation, also says of Grant, "Nothing came from the general before death which could be called his dying words." The request for water and an earlier answer of no when asked if he was in pain were presented as fleeting whispers in his final hours. Grant was in no condition to utter anything more eloquent. He had been dying of throat cancer for some time, and his voice was almost completely gone by the end. But if Grant lost his voice in his final months, he didn't lose his way with words. Left financially destitute, Grant accepted an offer from Mark Twain to publish his memoirs and leave behind some money for his family. He wrote at a furious pace. His doctors credited his drive to finish the book with keeping him alive, even as he lost the ability to eat. Writing also became the easiest way for Grant to communicate with others. In lieu of speaking, he scribbled out quick notes. It was one of these notes that could be taken for Grant's last words. On July 11, 1885, he wrote, "I feel as if I cannot endure it any longer." 12 days later, he died. His memoir, completed, was a massive success.
North and South, it was just a national outpouring of grief for him.
Rutherford B. Hayes didn't expect to become president in 1876, despite being the Republican candidate. The political tide seemed in the Democrats' favor. But while their candidate Samuel J. Tilden did win the popular vote, a months-long dust-up over the electoral vote put the election in Congress's hands, and Hayes was delivered to the White House by one vote. Once there, he had the end of Reconstruction and the state of the civil service to contend with, challenges he met to his satisfaction. Later generations have given his administration a more mixed assessment, having seen the long-term consequences. In this, Hayes was not unlike his pre-Civil War predecessor, James K. Polk. Also like Polk, Hayes promised only to serve a single term as president, and both men met their deaths by thinking of their wives. In Hayes' case, his wife Lucy, nicknamed Lemonade Lucy for her advocacy of temperance, was a popular first lady and hostess. She and Hayes married in 1852 and had 8 children together, 5 of them reaching adulthood. After leaving the White House in 1881, the Hayeses enjoyed their retirement in Fremont, Ohio. Lucy predeceased her husband, going in 1889. Hayes wouldn't long outlive her. Suffering from heart disease, he died on January 17, 1893. In the appendix to his published diaries, it was noted that he told his doctor just before his death, "I know that I shall soon be where Lucy is." Theodore Roosevelt kept his reputation for energetic and competitive living until the end. According to the UVA Miller Center, when he finally gave up the ghost on January 6, 1919, at least one member of the press remarked that death could only come for Roosevelt in the night, in his sleep. The former president would have put up a fight otherwise. The former president was aiming to be re-elected when he died. Having run second against Woodrow Wilson in 1912, Roosevelt spent the next 8 years criticizing the Wilson administration while advocating for U.S. entry into World War I. The latter cause came back to haunt him when America finally did join the fray. Roosevelt's offer of a volunteer troop was refused by the government, but his youngest son Quentin crossed the Atlantic only to die from German air fire. Despite his grief, Roosevelt continued to campaign for the war and to lay the groundwork for a run at the Republican nomination for president in 1920. Roosevelt spent January 5th editing an article tied into his future political plans. According to the New York Times, he was attended by his longtime valet, James Amos. When Roosevelt was ready to retire, he asked Amos, "James, will you please put out the light?" Those were his last words before dying of a coronary embolism. Franklin Delano Roosevelt didn't have the same reputation for action as his cousin Theodore, but he did succeed where the older Roosevelt had failed. He won a third and then a fourth term as U.S. president. Add to that his overseeing of the New Deal and America's entry into World War II, and he had among the most impactful administrations as well as the longest, his policies and reforms setting the stage for American prosperity for decades to come.
We must be prepared to move forward.
Roosevelt had his own charisma to match his cousin's, encouraging a confident and optimistic outlook, and positioning the president as a more forceful presence in the legislative process. But by 1945, his energies were sagging. Even before the 1944 election, Roosevelt's health was in decline, a fact unknown to most voters. After winning re-election and attending the Yalta Conference, he retired to his cottage in Warm Springs, Georgia. According to PBS, Roosevelt, who suffered from hypertension and related ailments, hoped to recover in Georgia. But on April 12, 1945, while reading and writing, he complained to his cousin Daisy Suckley, "I have a terrific pain in the back of my head." Suckley summoned Roosevelt's doctor, but there was nothing he could do. By 3:35 p.m. that day, he was dead. Dwight D. Eisenhower is more appreciated by historians and political observers now than he was in his own time. He tended to work best behind closed doors, and records of his involvement with the issues of his day were long unavailable. Presented as a sometimes awkward public speaker who often vacationed, Eisenhower's contemporaries might have liked him, but they also judged him as average at best as a political leader. But Eisenhower successfully kept America out of new wars, continued the post-war economic boom, and made incremental advancements in civil rights. After leaving office, Eisenhower continued to play a quiet, behind-the-scenes role as an advisor to his Democratic successors while living on a farm outside Gettysburg. But having suffered a heart attack in 1955, Eisenhower had another 10 years later. By 1968, he was a resident patient at Walter Reed Army Hospital, and by March the following year, he was dying. In his eulogy for Eisenhower, President Richard Nixon shared his predecessor's last words, which he spoke to his wife, Mamie. "I have always loved my wife. I have always loved my children. I have always loved my grandchildren. And I have always loved my country." But afterwards, Eisenhower took his wife's hand and told his son and grandson, "I want to go. God take me." He died on March 28, 1969.
General Eisenhower died today. His death was peaceful and natural.
Retirement was a complicated time for Lyndon B. Johnson. He vowed to enjoy his remaining years when he left the White House in 1969, a decision motivated in part by the life expectancy among men in his family. And he did enjoy himself, sometimes. He played Santa to the families of his ranch workers in Texas, took a hands-on role in the construction of the LBJ Library, and indulged his long-dormant smoking vice, despite the protests of his children. Friends and visitors to the ranch were often subjected to his stubborn schedule and unique rules of golf. But Johnson frequently slipped into spells of bitterness and retirement. He was bitter toward the press for how they treated him in and out of office. He was bitter about perceptions of him following the Vietnam War, and he had conflicting feelings about the Nixon administration and his diminished role in Democratic politics. His attitude toward his own life and health turned fatalistic with failing health. He told friends, "The doctors tell me there is nothing they can do for me. Anyway, when I go, I want to go fast." Johnson died on January 22, 1973. According to Time, his last words were a call asking for a Secret Service agent. "Send Mike immediately." The Secret Service responded, but too late to save his life. The press, filmmakers, and satirists read a complicated and sometimes resentful nature into the relationship between the two George Bushes. The presidential legacies were also contrasted. George H.W. Bush, Ronald Reagan's vice president and a long-serving public figure, sought continuity with his predecessor and moved cautiously. He was considered a success in foreign affairs, but lost his bid for re-election after an economic downturn back home. His son George W. Bush enjoyed a full 8 years as president, but entered and left the White House under storms of controversy. It's been suggested that the Iraq War was motivated, at least in part, by the younger Bush wanting to either avenge a plot by Saddam Hussein to kill his father, or to accomplish the overthrow of Hussein's regime that his father never did. George W. denied those claims. But according to the New York Times, the last words that George H.W. Bush said before dying on November 30, 2018, were to his eldest son. He'd been in declining health for some time and had told his friend James A. Baker III that he was looking forward to heaven. On the day he died, Bush was in his Houston home when George W. called to say his last goodbyes. When he said that he loved his father, Bush replied, "I love you too."